Everybody, this is Toru, and in a way, so are you. Welcome back to another episode of Producer Head. Stoked to let you know today we have Greg David on the show. What's up, man?
How's it going? How's everybody?
I'll speak for everybody. They're doing well. Or they're not, and we're going to help with that.
Add the clapping later.
Oh, man, so stoked to have you on today. Thank you for being here. And for the listening room, track number 1, what do you have for us?
Well, the first song that I got is Sharon Jones, Sail On.
So here we have Sharon Jones and the Dap-Kings, Sail On, in 3, 2, 1.
Well, look who's here. Oh, won't you come on in? It's been a long, long time. How have you been? Oh, no. Tell me it ain't so. So they threw you out. Now you got nowhere to go. Wait a minute. I don't suppose you might recall when I came knocking at your door. You said, sail on. You told me to sail on. Said, sail on. You told me to sail on. Sail on. Wait a minute. If I do to you what you did to me, tell me, where would we be? Two people stranded without a helping hand. Two people stranded, neither one a friend. Come on in, come on in, come on in, come on in. I said, come on in, come on in now. You and me, we gonna sail on, sail on. I said we gonna sail on, yeah. Sail on, sail on, sail on, hey, sail on. You gonna sail on, hey, sail on.
Wow. Sharon Jones and the Dap-Kings, Sail On. Why did you bring us this track today?
Well, the reason I brought that track is I think it's a good example of doing comps together as a band, but doing separate takes. I think something that's kind of lost on music today is the fact that we do everything in little bits and pieces. It's always little 4 to 8, 16 bar loops. Excuse me. This is a good example of musicians playing in the room together, and there's overdubs on it, horn overdubs that I'm sure from what I can see or hear that they probably did it as sections or pieces. Rhythm section first, then horn overdubs, then the vocal. I'm not sure exactly if that's how they did it, but I'm assuming. But yeah, I think it's just like a good discipline to follow. If you're used to doing a lot of loops and stuff like that, try to break out and do a 3-minute take of something. You'd be surprised what it'll force you to do.
Gotcha. Interesting. So The idea that instead of trying to just like sit down and be like, okay, the goal is to get something that's 2 or 4 bars, to play something that's just longer in general. So if you're playing an entire song without stopping, for instance.
Yeah. I mean, it's a different discipline. Just because you have to think less of the intricacies and think more of just having a solid performance. And, you know, sometimes if you're playing live or something, you always have those, that feeling kind of, all right, I messed up. I just need to keep going, right? That's pretty common when you're playing live. But in the studio, you don't really have that luxury. So you have to find kind of a safe ground between being spontaneous and having a take that's solid all the way through. And I think it's really like forced me, to kind of simplify things when I write and not get too overzealous in terms of too many things going on, too much busyness. It kind of forces me to be a little simpler when I write.
And then what do you like? The mix on this is pretty interesting, no? Just in the way that everything is sitting.
Yeah, that too. I mean, it's very glued together. It doesn't hear like, from my ears, it doesn't sound like there's tons of compression on it either. And if there is, it's only to excite things. I kind of like the glue of it, just the way that the instruments sit together, and you know, you can tell they didn't do too much to the mix. They didn't overproduce it, which is something that I'm trying to work on myself lately, just not overdoing things.
Yeah, it sounds like the vocal is the only thing that's in the center on that mix.
Yeah, I mean, that's another thing that I find interesting about those style tracks. Like, you know, Wolfpack does this a lot in their music, where they'll pan things in a non-traditional way. You know, like back in the 60s, when stereo was invented, they just had the ability to pan things left and right, so they were putting the drums in the left and the bass in the right, and we don't really do that, you know, today. Everything is linear, you know, everything is like balanced, and I find it just really fascinating when you can like make a mix that feels just as potent, but not do kind of the traditional, you know, wide guitars, bass in the center, kick drum in the center, snare in the center. It'll really force you to like add some type of like percussiveness in your bass, for instance, if the bass is all the way on the left and, you know, the drums are on the right. It like forces you to do different things in your mixing process that you kind of wouldn't normally do, you know?
What do you have for track 2?
DJ Harrison, Be Better.
All right. From the man DJ Harrison, Be Better, in 3, 2, 1.
Ashes, dust, dust. Gotta say goodbye if it must. I just wanna be better. Y'all know talk is cheap, so be careful of the company you keep. I just wanna be better. See you rolling fast. How long you think it's gonna last? I just wanna be better. Smile all over town, still go on with a ride. I just wanna be better. Sunshine, I need the sunshine. Let's get the sunshine. I need the sunshine. Still trying to live my best life in the midst of the stress and strife. I just wanna be better. They say they're your friend, but was they there in the end? I just wanna be better. Tired of backing up, I think I had enough. I just wanna be better.
Tell us about that one, man. DJ Harrison's Be Better.
You know, like the other one, just a very glued mix. A lot of the instruments sound live to me. I'm not sure if the drums were like one take or, but it doesn't sound like there's a lot of overdubs in it. The organicness of the way that the record sounds. You can hear a lot of different textures in the mix. Everything like sits in that mid-range, but when things get louder, you know, they don't sound like they poke through the mix. It's just like the low end of the mix is really tight, and I kind of look for that in mixes, you know, tight low end glue, fat low end, not a lot of high end, but just enough that it feels inviting.
Interesting. Yeah, I really feel like it's interesting because, yeah, when you compare it, it's sort of like the Sharon Jones is like intentionally done to sound like it comes from a different era. And then this, to me, right, feels like
more modern.
Right, but it's very much like if you were those people had access to what we have today and like the sort of frame through which we do mixes and construct music, right? So it's almost because it has sort of this like Sly Stone, like George Clinton kind of thing, you know, but it is super modern and very hip hop in the way that the mix is kind of done.
Yeah, I think it has a lot to do with the loudness of it, you know, because those like old school recordings, you know, from the 60s and that, they're not as loud. You know, they didn't need to be that loud back then. You know, if you're lucky, like you had a little transistor radio in your pocket. Or, you know, I don't really know because I was born in 89, but that's what everybody tells me anyways. Yeah, just the everything kind of sounds vintage, but it's modern, like you said. So it's a good contrast. Like the songs I picked really, like I kind of had a reason. You know, I picked 3 different songs, one that sounds like it's from an old era, one that's kind of modern, and then the last one that I picked is kind of a very high-fidelity new recording. And that's what I try to have this juxtaposition in my music. These are things that I look for, you know, like vintage, but modern also.
Hey, can you take a second just in case people are unfamiliar with this language, like, because you're talking a lot about one take versus overdubbing. So can you explain first like what they are and then your feelings about how they impact the way music sounds and feels?
You know, because we work in DAWs, we're normally working in loops. You know, these loops are usually like a 4 or 8 bar loop. They could be, you know, simpler than that. But most people construct music in terms of like they just add things, one thing after another. Well, back in the day, they would do that, but they would do it kind of in a different way. They would do a lot of things at once, for instance. So, say it was like a James Brown record. They might have the rhythm section all play together, so drums, bass, guitar, rhythm track. And then they would do an overdub. And to kind of keep it simpler, what they would do is they would use, less microphones. Too. So what happens is you have less decisions to make because you don't have 10 microphones up. You only have, say, 2, for instance. And what happens is you have this like solid rhythm track, and if you're going to overdub over it and you're going to try to get like a take from start to finish, you know, that's kind of how they used to do it back in the day. Like, I don't think most people can hear if something's looped or not. I honestly think the best producers, like, hide that stuff. You know what I mean? Like, the fades. If you can make your recording sound, like, natural and you looped it, but it doesn't sound like you looped it, that's, like, good. It's like modern overdubbing to me. That makes any sense.
Right, and so what you're saying when you say a rhythm track, you're speaking to drums, bass, maybe piano, rhythm, guitar, and that's all recorded at the same time with separate people playing them. And then lead parts, in the case of like the Sharon Jones track, for instance, horns after the fact, then being that person's playing horns over, and that horn part is being recorded, but they're playing it not with the live band, but to the recording that was made by the band previously.
Yeah, exactly. And what happens, or what would happen, is they would have like extra microphones on, or like, oh, the background singers, they sang but the mics are still on and it's in the recording, so like you get all these little kind of ghost frequencies that are happening in the recording, and we just don't do things like that nowadays. So a lot of that stuff is kind of lost. We're so like kind of invested in the micro that the macro kind of gets lost. Like when I'm thinking about doing these 3 to 4 minute takes, like I'm really trying to look at the macro of the song. What does this song feel like from start to finish? And there's peaks and valleys in it. And if the band is all kind of ebbing and flowing together, it feels different. Like it's not super tight and linear like if you were to loop a bunch of things, which is cool too. Like not taking anything away from that. It's just if you can challenge yourself to do 3 minute takes, I mean, it's just a different way of doing things.
No, man, it's so cool that you bring this up, actually, because I just kind of was working on something that I think I'm going to put out, I hope. And I almost never do that, right? But for some reason, one day, a couple months ago, I just sat down and I had the drums are looped. I can't remember. They're either a 4 or an 8 bar loop, so they might be a little bit longer than your typical drum loop. But they're very live feeling. And I just, one instrument at a time, for instance, took the Rhodes and just played like a Rhodes bass line that I accidentally came up with over and over again. And I think it was for something, I wasn't keeping track, but I stopped and it was around 3 minutes or so. And then I did the same thing and then just overdubbed the guitar over those 2 tracks. And then I just went back and ended up kind of muting different parts of each track. And while like there is a lot of repetition and there are certain things that are more or less the same, there's also like a little bit of subtlety in the way that I do it every time. So it's like just enough, because I do think there's something that we have as listeners. We can tell that it's not completely a loop, even if we can't see exactly where or tell you exactly where. It's something that feels like it has more movement in it.
Yeah, I mean, I'll try sometimes, even if I'm going to loop something, I'll re-record it in most cases, just because, like, it's so easy to just loop something. It sounds, to the listener, it sounds the same. The average listener, rather. It just sounds consistent to them. But, like, it doesn't feel like it's changing. It's the same thing statically for 3 minutes. So if you don't have a little variation in it, things can get stagnant kind of real quick. And if you can just retrack things just like with a little variation in them, say verse 1, you play quarter notes or eighth notes. And then the second time when you do it on verse 2, you play sixteenths to increase the information, you know what I mean? They could be this similar feeling, but just maybe a little bit more or a little bit less. Or if you're simply just taking the same part and putting on your second verse, just re-recording it, the same exact thing, it's going to feel a little bit different. It might sound really close, but it's going to have a little variation in it, and that variation is ear candy.
2 things. One, can you explain what you mean when you say increase information? And then the second is, can you basically illustrate what you just described using an example? Maybe it's an instrument or multiple instruments.
So for instance, I mean, you want a song to have a natural dynamic to it, right? You don't want to have, like, if you have one loop the whole time, the dynamics stay consistent, which isn't good necessarily. It's good to keep the energy up, but you got to have some sort of change. It's got to be a little bit different. So by more information, say for instance, you're playing quarter notes and you're accenting the 1 on a guitar, for instance. The second time you do the verse, you don't want to change it necessarily. You want it to sound the same, but you want it to feel a little bit different. You know, they talk about this a lot in kind of pop songwriting 101, is to re-record something but add a little bit more each time. And what I try to do is, like, first verse, I keep it simple, maybe just the guitar chords. And I'm speaking just one instrument, but say I'll just play the guitar chords, and then next time around on the second verse, maybe I'll add some signal note staccato stuff, and I'll pan that to the left and the right. And maybe I'll play a little bit more emphasis on the ands of the measures, 1 and 2 and 3. I'll add a little variation in between the quarter notes. That variation every time, it makes you listen and go, that sounds familiar, but it's a little different this time. If you do that with lyrics as well, that can be great too for a song, but definitely for instruments for sure.
Thank you for that. And track 3.
Track 3, I picked a new track that I just heard the other day. Disclosure's She's Gone.
Love the variety that we got going on in here today.
Yeah, trying to switch it up a little bit, a little bit of this, a little bit of that.
Yeah, all right, let's go. Disclosure, She's Gone, Dance On. In 3, 2, 1. Yeah, so pretty much the same as the other two tracks, yeah?
Yeah, similar, but modern. Modern mix, very loud, limited. Doesn't sound like a lot of tape saturation on it. Just sounds like a very modern, clean mix to me.
Do you think that's a real bass, or do you think that's a synth?
As far as I know, they played that in the studio live. That's a live recording from what I... There's video on YouTube.
Oh, really cool. Yeah, that's it sounds so... I mean, it's interesting, right? Because that bass versus the DJ Harrison one, for instance, it feels like that DJ Harrison one feels like that's a mic'd amp, whereas this one feels like a very DI, clean...
Yeah, I mean, it could be both for either. I think it's just a matter of saturation. I think, like, on the Disclosure song, it's a very clean third-order harmonics, very smooth distortion. On the Sharon Jones and the DJ Harrison track, it's more like kind of vintage tape saturation. I kind of hear, like, the breakup of the tape, and... that could be in mixing, or they track the tape or whatever, but I think it's interesting the contrast between the two. They're both acceptable, both interesting, but different mix techniques on both of them, you know what I mean?
What do you like about the Disclosure track? Because I would say, based on the music of yours that I'm familiar with, I would say that's in terms of like the feel and the energy, it's the most different from what you make.
Yeah, I mean, like, I think in my early stages of being a producer, I kind of leaned more towards, like, heavily distorted, saturated sounds, and as time goes on, I'm kind of, like, appreciating more high-fidelity stuff lately. Like, seeing the trend in music, and, like, a lot of people talk about the whole, like, lo-fi thing or whatever. I feel like that stuff is just mixing choices. And I think once I started playing with musicians in a studio and kind of getting a sense of how all that works, I started gravitating towards more, like, high-fidelity mixing, because... like, you can appreciate different forms of that stuff, like how far you take saturation in your mix, and it can lend to the style of music that you're making. I feel like that Disclosure song is a good example of the mix is clean, it's a good song, all the musicians are playing together and they're feeding off of each other's energy, but the mix isn't, like, obliterated when it comes to, like, saturation. It's just clean, and you can hear every dynamic and transient,
Mm-hmm. I think what really, for me, in a style of music that just is built on a lot of repetition, the creativity and the way that they kind of do turnarounds and things like that, and the different ways that they use to let you know that a change is coming or that 4 bars is up is really, really cool. And really varied. Yeah.
Definitely tension, it's like you can feel, like, if you write great chords and it leads you into the right place, you can add that tension just by playing the right chords and not resolving them, or stuff's really interesting.
Yeah, that's cool. So when you sit down to make something, do you typically start with chords? Are you typically starting with the drum beat?
For me, it's always usually the drums for the most part. I mean, excuse me, I've been experimenting, trying other forms just because I don't want to get, like, stuck too much in a pattern when it comes to, like, my creation process. But it could be, I would say 90% of the time it's drums that move me. Whether that's, like, getting a drummer, programming drums, sampling something, sampling myself. It's usually drums first for the most part.
Cool, man. And so do you keep, let's say you're about to sit down, do you keep sort of a folder of drums that are ready to go? Or do you start every time and you're like, okay, well, if I'm going to start working on something, I have to lay down this drum groove right now, whether it's playing it yourself or programming them?
I do have a folder on my desktop. Excuse me, about a year and a half, 2 years ago, I started just like recording tons of drum breaks. I got a tape machine, a Tascam 388, and it kind of like put me down this path of, okay, you got 8 channels, you got 8 drum mics, let's just plug it in. And like I was getting frustrated recording because I would have to redo things a lot, like unplug cords and shit like that. And I kind of just like set a drum kit up and didn't touch it for like a whole year. Just like, I mean, I moved the mics and stuff like that to try to find better mic placements, but I left a kit there and I just said, you know what, I'm gonna track this drum kit every day and try to just figure out like what makes it tick for me, you know, like what am I missing in my own drum recordings that I hear in everybody else's? And I wanted to know that for myself, and I kind of just like started recording drums every day, and I would make them in Ableton, and I would just bounce the track, just like a 2-track into a folder. And when I'm starting to make a song, what I do is I go in that folder and I just grab like 20 loops on it, and I just start cutting one-shots out of it. Like, it's obviously highly dependent on how I'm making the song. Like, this is just by myself, obviously. If I'm working on a track by myself, that's kind of how I do it for the most part.
Can you describe real quick what a one-shot is also?
Yeah, I mean, a one-shot to me is, you know, taking an 8-bar loop and just cutting like a 1 or 2 milliseconds out of it, of a snare drum or a kick drum or a hi-hat. Could be anything, really.
That seems like a really cool place, man, because what you mentioned to me last time we talked that you at some point gave up sampling cold turkey.
Yeah, I did. I stopped sampling anything, and there wasn't any particular reason. I think I just got I was just starting to get kind of bored with like, there's so many samples out there, don't get me wrong, like you could have hours of creativity just like going through sample packs, but I really like the process. Like, I like the discovery of making all this stuff, and I kind of realized that when it was like one random day, and I'm like, you know what, I'm gonna make everything in this song. Like, instead of grabbing a snare or a kick drum or and I just turned on a microphone. At the time I had like just an SM57. I didn't have like a ton of drum mics or anything, and I turned on an SM57 and I just had like a few drums in my apartment, and I would just sample them. You know, let me do a kick drum, let me do a snare. And it just like opened up this whole journey for me of like, I just start listening to music and trying to identify things in it. So yeah, I gave up sampling, and I have not really used any samples other than like claps and snaps for like 2 years, give or take, and it's been fun.
Yeah, and so how do you think that's changed your music, the way that it sounds, the way that you make it?
It's kind of enabled me to sound like me. Like, if you make all of your sonics by yourself, every single sound, you can't escape yourself. It will sound like you inevitably. If you use samples, you know, you're taking a little bit, it's like a kind of like a collage art at that point, because you're taking all these ideas from everybody else and you're trying to make your, you know, whatever you vibe off of, whatever like kind of gets you off in terms of, you know, music. And I think once you discover like the sounds that actually inspire you and you start to learn about them, it will develop your sense of like exploration, musical exploration. Like, I didn't know what certain instruments were, so I like it put me down the path to learn what they were. And once I knew what they were and I heard it and I met someone that could play the instrument, now I can tell them exactly what I want to play. So yeah, sorry for the long-winded answer, but
no, that's why we're here. So what I'm curious about, as you're talking about this, I'm like, okay, so when you were using or working from a more sample-based approach, when you compare that to how you work now, what I'm curious about is, I don't know how you think about your process, but if we think about it in a high level in terms of maybe writing, production, mixing, mastering, maybe you would break it down differently. Where do you, has the way that you spend your time, you know, as a percentage of total changed in each part of the process?
like the amount of time that I take in between things to develop ideas, I mean?
Yeah, I'm wondering if you spend more time in one of those areas of the process as a result of changing the way that you make music or from making samples off limits.
Yes, I mean, absolutely. I mean, to be fair, like when I did sample before, I would always use one-shots anyways. Like, I was never the type of producer that would just take a loop and make a song over it. Like, my, OCD or whatever, it doesn't allow that. Like, I have to make it my own, So I never really just, like, sampled like most producers do to begin with. But when I did sample, it was like little bits and pieces and parts, and it would never quite be what I wanted it to be. But when I did get involved in like programming synths and making the sounds from scratch, it actually does the opposite. You'd think you would spend more time like delving into things, but if you know enough about it, it's very quick. Like now when I walk up to a synth to explain, if everybody knows what ADSR is, attack, decay, sustain, release, if you know how to use this, it's such a powerful tool across all instruments. And once you understand that, it should save you time.
Do you want to go there?
We could go there, man. That's the deep end. That is the deep end right there.
What I'm saying
is, start talking about side chains, it's over.
So, I mean, look, I think because part of what you just said, I do think is really cool to maybe touch on at least a little bit. Maybe one is if you want to give us, just to kind of give like the 101, what is ADSR? But what I really like about what you just brought up is outside of synths, to think about applying that concept to all instruments, which I don't think people, at least explicitly, talk about as much. And I do think that's a really fun thing to talk about in terms of manipulating transients on different kinds of instruments and the way that they behave, even after the fact, after they've been recorded and so on. So, sorry, that was a lot. So, but I guess the first part is describe ADSR in a brief way so that in case there's somebody listening who doesn't understand, they know what that is. And then also the way that you think about applying that in different instrumental contexts.
So to explain ADSR, instead of just explaining it, I'm going to give you an audio example. Attack, decay, sustain, release. So attack is the amount of force the sound has. The sound, the force to it. The decay is the amount of takes for the sound to trail off from the highest point to the lowest, 0 dB. That's sustained note. In classical music, they would call that crescendo. Then you have sustain, which is a lot like decay, but it's measured in the amount of time that it takes for the envelope to close. So decay could be da, it could be da, or it could be duh. That's a long decay. When you have a sense of all these things, and I know it sounds foolish when I make those sounds, but if you apply that to everything, drums, vocals, guitar, bass, the amount of time that you hold something is ADSR. If you put it in your hand and you drop it, that's a fast attack, decay, sustain, release. If you put it in your hand and you hold on to it for a little bit, that's a long decay, long sustain. So when you're applying that to different frequencies, for instance, like we'll say bass, as like a mixing technique, if I'm gravitating towards controlling the transients on bass, I'm going to go towards a transient designer. And what I might do is I might limit the amount of high-end frequency that decays in the sound so that that doesn't get in the way of the other high frequencies. Or as another example, on drums, back in the 50s, in Motown songs, you would hear the kick drums really long, and it creates a note. So if you have a short decay, the kick drum won't go boom. It'll just go boom. Very quick. Kind of the older the music is usually, the longer the decay in it. But yeah, I can keep going, but there's... all this applies to every instrument.
You touched on attack, decay, sustain. I don't think we got to release.
Oh, sorry. Now, release is, well, like I said, the amount of time that you hold it for, right? So, if it's a sustained note, for instance, say on a piano, we'll say, and you hit the note, ding. Well, if you let it go real quick, that means it has a fast release time. Ding, ding, it happens immediately. When you apply this concept to compression, it works the same exact way. It's no different. It's the amount of time that the compressor grabs on the note and holds onto it for. Your release time should depend on your tempo and the amount of energy that you want to put into the sound.
Okay, interesting. So, I feel like from here I have to go in and ask you about, we're just kind of getting into mixing, and we've kind of been talking about it underneath everything the whole time. So, can you describe, I guess, your mixing philosophy, high level? We'll start there.
Man, that's such a broad question. What do you mean?
All right, let's think about it this way. Let's say I'm a new producer, or I'm a producer who feels like I want to get better at mixing. What do you say, this is what mixing is to you?
Mixing to me is finding an appropriate location for everything in the mix. And also, frequencies can be overlapping. You don't necessarily need to pick certain frequencies to exist in the same space, but I feel like mixing is making room for things so that they breathe together. So putting them in the right location and making them work, giving them some sort of synergy in between themselves.
What do you think most people get wrong or don't understand about compression?
I know from my own experience, I can't speak for everybody else, but I can tell you from my own experience what I got wrong most of the time is realizing.
That's it for part one of this conversation with Greg David. Big thanks to him for sharing valuable insights on mixing, dynamics, and finding that balance between spontaneity and precision in music. Don't miss out on part two of our conversation with Greg David, where we'll dive deeper into the importance of collaboration, finding balance in the creative process, and how embracing simplicity can unlock the true essence of a track. If you enjoyed this episode of Producer Head, please subscribe, share with a friend, and leave a rating and review wherever you're listening. This helps Producer Head find its people, and without you, there is no Producer Head. Thanks again for listening to this episode of Producer Head. Don't forget to head over to torubeat.substack.com and subscribe so you never miss an episode, along with some great extras like episode transcripts and access to the bi-weekly podium, a curation of my 3 favorite discoveries from on and offline over the past week. It's a 2-minute read providing you with a personal soundtrack, ideas, and inspiration you can use immediately. I promise you won't want to miss this. Join the community of producers receiving personally curated music, ideas, and inspiration to develop their craft. Subscribe at torubeat.substack.com. This episode was co-produced, engineered, and edited by Matthew Diaz. From Producer Head, this has been Toru, and in a way, so were you. Peace.